Imagine a species so violent, so relentless, that they turned survival into an art form and turned memory itself into a weapon. Imagine facing an enemy that has practiced annihilating its own kind for thousands of years, just to be ready for you. What happens when humanity stops fighting itself and starts fighting the galaxy? Stay until the end to discover why the universe fears Earth more than any empire ever built. Trust me, you won't want to miss the end of this story, because what humanity does next will change the galaxy forever. Stick with us and witness the madness unfold. Welcome to HFY Sci-Fi Love and War Story, where we explore the darkest, wildest truths about humanity and the stars. Before we dive into the heart of this brutal story, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more mind-bending journeys through war, survival, and impossible victories. Here's a question for you. If humanity could survive anything, what do you think would finally stop them? Comment your thoughts below. To prove you're one of the elite who made it this far, use the secret phrase forged in chaos in your comment. Let's see who's really paying attention. The Galactic War Academy floated adrift near twin dying stars, a grotesque monument to civilizations that had never quite outgrown the need to kill things more efficiently. From orbit, it resembled a piece of broken jewelry, shattered grandeur held together by the stubborn glue of bureaucracy and a million grant applications. A fitting place, perhaps, to teach the art of war. Inside Lecture Hall 7, which smelled faintly of industrial disinfectant and desperate ambition, 72 species of cadets shifted uncomfortably in their ergonomically miscalibrated seats. The Academy boasted about their multi-biological design, yet managed to craft a chair that universally tortured every spinal structure known to the Confederation. Professor Vraxel glided to the front of the hall, his three ocular nodes blinking asynchronously. Vraxel, who had never personally seen a battlefield unless one counted the annual parking disputes between faculty departments, adjusted his ceremonial robes and tapped the control console with the air of a man about to deliver a divine revelation. This cycle, Vraxel announced, his voices harmonizing in smug chorus, we embark upon the Primitive Species Combat Analysis course. A ripple of boredom spread through the room, as if a collective exhale of disappointment had drifted over the gathered cadets. Another year, another analysis of some poor backwater species flinging sharpened rocks at each other while howling at their primitive gods. They had seen this show before, and it was never particularly enlightening unless you enjoyed the anthropology of failure. Somewhere in the third row, a Crithian cadet with iridescent scales idly scratched something obscene into his data tablet. A neighboring Prontalian clicked their mandibles in dry amusement. I hope it's not the Murgles again, the Crithian muttered. Last year's lecture was like watching drunk slugs try to invent murder. I heard, whispered the Prontalian, we might get the Doraxians. At least they nuked themselves out of sheer innovation. The universe, after all, was not short on idiots with weapons. Professor Vraxel's breathing sacs inflated pompously. This cycle, he repeated, savoring the dramatic pause like a gourmand inhaling soup fumes, we study a particularly curious case, humans from planet Earth. A collective groan rumbled through the hall. Humans? Seriously, groaned a gelatinous blurb cadet occupying 3 seats at once. They barely made it to their own moon. How are we supposed to take them seriously? You are not required to take them seriously, Vraxel replied, his smiles all thin and bureaucratic. Only to learn. From the back of the hall, the heavy thud of battle-scarred feet announced Commander Zern's arrival. If Vraxel was a man who spoke of wars he never fought, Zern was the kind who survived wars no one else remembered. His exoskeleton bore the etchings of 14 campaigns, his left sensory stalk, replaced with an unpolished cybernetic implant, twitched slightly as he surveyed the room. When he spoke, the air itself seemed to listen. Humans, he said, voice rough as a landing pod scraping atmosphere, are not what they appear. A Sandar cadet raised a trembling limb. Sir, respectfully, they have no claws, no exoskeletons, no venom glands. Their neural capacity is mediocre. Their musculature is laughable. They require sleep cycles for a third of their lifespan. The cadet faltered, searching for a word that wouldn't immediately provoke disciplinary action. Commander Zern let the silence stretch, long and thin as a noose. And yet, Zern said at last, they survived. There was something about the way he said it, not admiration, not even respect. More like foreboding. As if survival, in the human context, was not something to celebrate but to fear. The holo display activated with a whir and projected a rotating image of Earth. Blue and green. Deceptively gentle. A Class M planet, Vraxel droned. Atmosphere primarily nitrogen-oxygen. One large moon. 70% surface water. Home to roughly 8 billion instances of organized confusion. He tapped again. A timeline unspooled, wars stacked atop wars, their bloody echoes stretching back 10,000 solar orbits. Unlike many species, Vraxel said, humans have waged organized warfare across the entirety of their recorded history. Tribal feuds became city wars. City wars became national conflicts. National conflicts became global slaughter. Their technological progression is erratic, driven not by reason, but desperation. A prickling unease crept into the hall. Imagine, murmured the Vulcan exchange student, a species whose greatest genius blooms only when they are trying to annihilate each other. Zern chuckled, low and hollow. Imagine, he said, what happens when they stop fighting themselves. The cadets fell silent, and for a heartbeat, the academy itself seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the vastness of space, the dying binary stars flickered, two cosmic warriors tearing each other apart for no reason anyone could remember anymore. Kind of like Earth, really. Except Earth charged admission and sold popcorn. The cadets returned the next day, most wearing the brittle smiles of people who thought they knew what was coming. They filed into the immersive tactical theater, a marvel of technology so advanced that it could simulate the smell of burning flesh with nauseating precision, a feature that had been advertised in the Academy brochure under the heading Unparalleled Realism with a cheerful exclamation mark. Some joked nervously as they took their seats, their carapaces, scales, membranes, or assorted appendages shifting uneasily under the atmospheric controls. A few less confident ones clutched their data slates like talismans, as if hastily skimming over Earth's history last night could somehow shield them from whatever fresh horror was about to unfold. The lights dimmed. The air thickened, not from any change in pressure, but from the collective sense of 1,000 bad decisions marching toward them on heavy boots. The first images flickered into existence, a muddy wasteland punctuated by barbed wire, craters, and the twisted skeletons of trees that had once dared to grow. World War I. A wordless silence settled over the cadets as the simulation activated not only sight and sound, but the deep, rancid stink of rot, gunpowder, and hopelessness. On screen, humans, fragile, skin-wrapped things, clambered over the edges of their trenches and into machine gun fire. They fell like brittle stalks of grain before the scythe. And then more came. And more. They kept coming. They came knowing they would die. A Vulcan cadet, who had previously scoffed at humanity's supposed lack of tactical sophistication, shrank visibly into their seat, their bioluminescent skin dimming to a dismal gray. Professor Vraxel's voice, smooth as an autopsy blade, narrated from the darkness. Observe the inefficiency, mass charges across open terrain against fortified positions. No advanced armor. No tactical teleportation. Just perseverance. The footage changed. Gas attacks, soldiers writhing in the mud as invisible poison clawed their lungs apart. A Crithian cadet, whose species viewed chemical warfare as the ultimate blasphemy against nature, let out a sharp clicking sound, a noise their kind only made in the presence of profound sacrilege. Commander Zern stood at the side of the room, his singular mechanical eye reflecting the greenish hue of chlorine gas. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The lesson was carving itself into the cadets with the slow inevitability of trench rot. The screen shifted again. Field hospitals. Rows of men missing limbs, faces burned beyond recognition, eyes staring at ceilings they would never see clearly again. A mechanoid cadet, whose entire existence was defined by the logic of efficiency, twitched in protest. Why, they finally asked, their voice a whir of desperate confusion. Why persist? Why not surrender to spare resources? No one answered. Perhaps because there was no answer that made sense outside the broken, blood-soaked riddle that was humanity. In one corner, a Cloran cadet, whose photosynthetic species had evolved without a concept of violence, vomited quietly into a portable waste unit, their leaf-like body trembling as if in a wind of horror. The simulation ended mercifully, plunging the room into darkness again. Professor Vraxel cleared his throat delicately, as if trying to expel the collective trauma from the air. Humans, he said, do not fight because it is logical. They fight because existence itself seems, to them, to require constant proof of worthiness. And because, he paused, his voice is lowering into something almost resembling pity. Because for them, loss is not a deterrent. It is a ritual. The lights rose halfway. Cadets glanced at each other, at the holographic mud still clinging to their simulated boots, at the ghost sounds of distant mortars still echoing faintly in their ears. Commander Zern finally stepped forward. His voice was low, almost intimate. You think this is their worst? He shook his head once, like a man brushing dirt from a grave. This was their first draft. The silence that followed was thick enough to chew. Somewhere deep within the Academy's ventilation system, a filtration drone whined pitifully, unable to scrub despair from the air. The cadet sat frozen, caught between incredulity and a dawning, skin-crawling awe. A small voice, a gelatinous blurb cadet who had so far maintained a running commentary of sarcastic remarks, piped up into the dead stillness. So, remind me why we're the advanced species again? No one laughed. Not yet, anyway. But in the pit of their many alien stomachs, every cadet knew. They had just seen the opening act, and humanity was only getting warmed up. The room, if it could still be called that, no longer felt like a classroom. It felt like a waiting room for trauma, only here, the magazines offered were war crimes and moral collapse. No one joked as the next simulation began. No nervous laughter, no clever quips. Just a heavy, expectant dread that sat between the cadets like an uninvited guest. The holoprojector hummed to life again. Images bloomed in the air, cities flattened under firebombing raids, entire skylines dissolving into ash and screams. Civilians running not from soldiers but from the sky itself, their smallness no shield against the ambition of annihilation. The voice of Professor Vraxel, once dripping with smug academic detachment, now carried a faint tremor. This conflict was designated the Second World War. Humans achieved escalation. He might as well have announced the invention of insanity. On screen, tanks rolled across shattered countrysides, their heavy tracks grinding bones and dreams alike into the mud. In the skies, aircraft blackened the sun itself, raining metal and flame in equal measure. The cadets watched as humans dropped bombs not on enemy armies, but on entire populations, factories, hospitals, schools. Anything that could breathe was fair game. A Cloran cadet whispered, almost reverently. They destroyed their own cities, on purpose. A mechanoid's internal processor stuttered, throwing out error codes in protest. Efficiency had fled the building, and taken morality with it. The images shifted. Footage from a beach invasion. Humans spilling out of landing crafts, charging into machine gun fire that stitched bloody lines through their ranks. 1 in 10 survived the first rush. The next wave stepped over the bodies and tried again. No shields. No teleporters. No orbital support. Just bare skin, stubborn bones, and the kind of suicidal hope that probably kept their gods awake at night. Commander Zern leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, his cybernetic sensor whirring softly. They knew it was hopeless, he said, his voice low, almost tender. They ran anyway. There was a pause long enough to feel like guilt. And then came the cities. Hiroshima. Nagasaki. The projector didn't soften the blow. It showed the flash, the bright, blooming birth of devastation, the mushroom cloud unfurling like a poisoned flower. It showed the shadows burned into walls where human beings had once stood. It showed the silence that followed, heavier than any scream. A Vulcan cadet pressed trembling hands to their face. Their species' greatest war, once upon a time, had resulted in exactly 13 casualties. Here, entire cities ceased to exist before lunch. The Hollow paused mercifully. Professor Vraxel, who had once lectured about primitive warfare with the smugness of a man describing bad plumbing, now spoke like someone reading a confession. These were early atomic devices. Crude, yet sufficient to alter the political and environmental trajectory of their species permanently. The cadets sat hollow-eyed, trying to make sense of a species that had not only invented planetary destruction, but had field-tested it on themselves. The images shifted again. Piles of bodies behind barbed wire fences. Eyes staring through the screen, some defiant, some empty, most just tired. Concentration camps. Systematic extermination, organized with terrifying efficiency. Death reduced to ledger entries and quotas. A Crithian cadet, normally unshakable, bolted from their seat and fled the room. No one judged them. How could they? Even the Academy's atmospheric systems, designed to filter out the emotional pheromones of dozens of species, struggled against the reek of horror and helplessness rising from the assembled cadets. In the quiet that followed, the hollow faded to black. And somehow, that darkness felt less comforting than the atrocities it replaced. Commander Zern finally spoke, his voice a dry rasp. They call themselves civilized. They call this progress. A blurb cadet, trying desperately to stitch together the tattered remains of their sanity, muttered. You know, back home, our worst crime is eating a relative's favorite moss cake without asking. It wasn't even funny. Not really. But somehow, it broke the dam. A wheezing, hysterical kind of laughter rippled through the room, too brutal to be joy, too raw to be anything but survival. Maybe, the cadets thought, Earth wasn't a planet. Maybe it was a bad joke the galaxy forgot to laugh at. The atmosphere in the theater had grown heavier than the artificial gravity generators could explain. The cadets sat stiff and silent as the next sequence flickered into view, bracing themselves for more bodies, more bombs, more ruins. But what appeared was different. No trenches. No mushroom clouds. No grand, operatic slaughter. Instead, a jungle. Dense. Sweltering. Alive with insects and death in equal measure. Professor Vraxel's voice, now stripped of all pretense of superiority, narrated quietly. The Vietnam conflict. An example of asymmetrical warfare, where the technologically inferior party adapts, by learning to bleed the superior force dry. The footage played. Young men, barely more than boys, slogging through tangled undergrowth, their eyes hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. Booby traps hidden under leaves. Snipers perched in trees, invisible until the bullet found its home. Patrols moved in constant dread of an enemy they almost never saw, only felt, like a ghost breathing down the back of the neck. Commander Zern stepped forward, his cybernetica narrowing against the humid green projections. Humans learned that killing bodies is easy. Breaking minds, though, that's how you win a war. It was not a tactical lesson. It was a confession. The cadets watched in horrified fascination as the footage shifted to scenes of villages burned to the ground, families scattered, trust annihilated. Not because it achieved strategic objectives. Because it created confusion, terror, despair. Psychological attrition. A mechanoid cadet, still struggling with the inefficiency of trench warfare, now simply shut down their secondary processors entirely, an unconscious defense mechanism. The Vulcan exchange student spoke softly. They understood their own vulnerability so intimately, they weaponized it. It wasn't admiration. It was mourning for a species clever enough to outthink hope. The hollow shifted. Posters fluttering down from helicopters. Leaflets promising safety, then delivering betrayal. Propaganda blaring from loudspeakers across the jungle, sowing suspicion like seeds in a graveyard. One cadet, a photosynthetic chlorin, blinked slowly as they watched an entire village turn on itself, driven by rumors carefully planted and cultivated. No bombs. No guns. just whispered lies, growing like tumors until brother murdered brother. They turned language into ammunition, Professor Vraxel said, almost inaudibly. Another shift. Scenes of prisoners, blindfolded and shackled, subjected to methods as old as cruelty itself. Sleep deprivation, sensory overload, starvation not of the body, but of the soul. Cadets shifted uncomfortably. Their species, so many of them, still fought like warriors of old, strength against strength, fleet against fleet. They were utterly unprepared for an enemy that fought like a virus inside the mind. The Vulcan student turned to Zurin, voice ragged. Why would they do this to themselves? Zurin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the screen as if reading a story he had long ago given up trying to rewrite. When he finally spoke, it was with a bleakness so profound it barely qualified as anger. Because in humanity's eyes, the mind is just another battlefield. And mercy is a luxury they can't afford when survival is on the line. Silence reigned again, deep, suffocating. The cadets, from dozens of worlds, each bearing the scars of their own ancient wars, realized something terrible. They were not studying humans as a case of primitive development. They were studying the future. Their future. Because if humanity's gift was to escalate every conflict into a new dimension of horror, then this kind of warfare, the slow, surgical destruction of belief and trust, was not the end of their history. It was only the beginning. The hollow paused on the image of a tired soldier scribbling in a mud-smeared journal, the words barely legible but the sentiment clear. If I die out here, it won't be from a bullet. It'll be because I forgot what home looks like. A soft, involuntary sound escaped from somewhere in the theater. A whimper? A prayer? A cracked laugh? At that moment, they were all the same thing. Professor Vraxel cleared his throat in that stiff, bureaucratic way that implied the universe should kindly get itself together. Tomorrow, he said, we move on to ideological warfare and civilian-targeted strategies. The collective groan was so synchronized it could have qualified as a planetary anthem. And then, from the back row, the blurb cadet, brave or foolish enough to still have a sense of humor, muttered. At this point, I'd rather be shot. At least bullets don't have trust issues. For once, nobody corrected them. The projector flickered again, and with it came a shift in the air, a subtle tightening, like a collective breath drawn and held. The cadets had learned, by now, that silence was safer than questions. Curiosity was a luxury they could no longer afford. The images that filled the space this time were not battlefields. Not in the traditional sense. No trenches. No tank formations. Instead, marketplaces. Concert halls. Subway stations. Everyday places, everyday faces, frozen mid-motion, mid-life, before being swallowed by sudden, violent ends. Professor Vraxel, whose once booming lectures had shriveled into something almost resembling shame, spoke. Welcome, he said dryly, to the modern era of human conflict. The simulation rolled on. Explosions ripping through morning commutes. Glass raining down on faces not yet old enough to understand what had been lost. Bodies scattered like broken toys across grocery store aisles. Terrorism. A war without fronts, without armies, only intent. Commander Zurin stepped forward, his battered frame casting a long shadow against the images. Humans discovered that fear itself is a more reliable weapon than any army. He said it not with admiration, but with the weary respect of a man who had fought too many wars and survived too many lessons. The cadets watched, frozen, as a child no older than 10 staggered from rubble, her face streaked with dust and blood. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't crying. She was silent. The kind of silence that could swallow a species whole. The Vulcan exchange student, whose people had once abolished war by codifying mercy into their DNA, whispered. They have turned survival into a religion, and every prayer sounds like a scream. The footage shifted again. Urban warfare. Not armies against armies, but factions against civilians, ideologies tearing through neighborhoods like wildfire through dry bone. The lines between soldier and bystander blurred until they became meaningless. Professor Vraxel gestured vaguely toward the chaos. Modern human conflict is no longer about territory. It is about identity. About erasing it. There were no safe places anymore. No front lines. No home fronts. Just endless, creeping suspicion. A mother eyeing the stranger at the bus stop. A teacher wondering if their student's backpack hid more than textbooks. A child learning that any loud noise might be their last. The Academy's emotional dampeners fought and failed against the raw despair seeping into the air. One of the cadets, a sand-dwelling species whose home planet had never known war, shivered visibly, their translucent skin paling. But why, they asked, their voice cracking. Why destroy what you claim to defend? No one answered. How could they? It was like asking why a fire continued to burn after the house was already ashes. The simulation shifted yet again, this time showing recruitment videos. Propaganda dripping with promises of glory, belonging, righteousness. A particularly slick production showed young men and women signing up for causes that would later eat them alive. Hope weaponized. Dreams sharpened into knives. Commander Zern watched with the detached expression of a man who had learned long ago that hope was only another word for bait. Humans, he said, do not fight because they are strong. They fight because they refuse to believe they are weak. Even when it kills them. Another shift. Drone strikes, cold and clinical, death delivered by machines piloted from halfway across the world. Surveillance networks mapping entire cities like blueprints of paranoia. No heroics. No last stands. Just quiet, efficient annihilation. Professor Vraxel sighed, a sound like crumpled paper. Victory, he said, has become irrelevant. Only survival matters now, and sometimes, not even that. The cadets looked around, each seeing, perhaps for the first time, not a species dragging itself toward the stars, but a species dragging its nightmares with it. And somehow moving faster because of them. The final scene lingered. A human woman, standing atop the rubble of her former home, holding a handmade sign that read, "We are still here." She smiled for the camera. Not a victorious smile. Not a defiant one. Just tired. Tired in a way that suggested she'd been born tired and simply hadn't found a good enough reason to stop yet. The simulation faded to black. Silence returned. Real silence this time, the kind you only get after understanding something you wish you hadn't. In the gloom, the blurb cadet, their gelatinous mass drooping with exhaustion, let out a low gurgle of attempted humor. At this point, I'm starting to think the humans didn't survive evolution. They just outstubborned it. Nobody laughed. But for the first time, nobody cried either. Maybe that, too, was a kind of victory. A very human one. The next sequence didn't start with explosions. There were no screaming bombs, no collapsing cities. Instead, the simulation opened on a monument. Marble and steel. Etched names. Flags fluttering in a half-hearted breeze. A memorial. A graveyard disguised as inspiration. Professor Vraxel's voice came slower now, as if even he needed a moment to chew through the bitterness. After centuries of warfare, humanity learned a final, terrible lesson. You don't need new wars to destroy yourself. You just need to remember the old ones, very loudly. The cadets sat rigid, not with fear now, but with the exhausted dread of survivors forced to watch the floodwaters rising again. The projection shifted. Footage of rallies, speeches shouted over candlelight vigils. Commander Zern, standing like a monument himself at the side of the room, spoke flatly. Pain became currency. Memory became weapon. The blurb cadet, slumped over like a melted candle, mumbled. Is there anything humans don't turn into a weapon? No one answered. Not because they didn't know. Because the only honest answer was, no. The footage continued. Children learning names of battles fought centuries before their births, carrying grudges so carefully nurtured they might as well have been heirlooms. Every loss remembered. Every injustice catalogued. A Vulcan cadet, whose species prided itself on ancestral peace treaties carved into their bones, whispered. They passed down grief the way others passed down songs. And not beautiful songs either. The hollow displayed new wars, wars born not from hunger, not from conquest, but from the echoes of old ones. Remember what they did to us, the speakers screamed. And humans, masters of reanimating their ghosts, obeyed. They remembered until remembering became an act of violence. The simulation shifted again, showing media cycles feeding outrage like coal into a furnace. Professor Vraxel's voice sharpened. They turned history into a battlefield. They turned grief into ammunition. One of the Crithian cadets, a tough, clawed species used to brutal skirmishes, scratched nervously at their desk. But surely, they muttered, surely memory can heal. A sad smile ghosted across Zern's scarred mandibles. It could have. But humanity preferred sharper tools. Another scene. Marches. Riots. Streets flooded with slogans that had outlived the people who first cried them. And amidst it all, statues falling. New ones rising. The Vulcan cadet covered their sensory tendrils, overwhelmed. They had evolved empathy so deep that feeling another's joy was automatic. The projection shifted once more. This time, a small group of humans stood in a shattered city square. Old women, bent and battered by too many decades, laying flowers at the feet of a crumbling monument. No speeches. No slogans. Just silence. For a heartbeat, a real one, the cadets glimpsed something terribly fragile. Grief without venom. Memory without weapon. But the screen shifted again before they could savor it. Back to riots. Back to torches. Professor Vraxel, perhaps sensing the flicker of hope he had accidentally unleashed, quickly restored the lesson. Humans, he said, mastered the art of turning survival into myth, and myth into motive. The hollow finally faded. But the stink of old grief, new wars, and eternal memory lingered. Commander Zern crossed the floor slowly, mechanical foot clicking against metal. They remember everything, he said. Except how to stop. Silence fell. A heavy, guilty silence. The cadets, now thoroughly educated in the art of despair, slumped back in their seats, their bodies and minds carrying the invisible scars of lessons learned too late. And then, true to form, the blurb cadet, still somehow clinging to humor like a drowning man clinging to a stone, gurgled. Maybe the real weapon wasn't bombs. Maybe it was grandma. Nobody laughed. Not properly. But somewhere, deep in the weary meat of their collective souls, something cracked, and that, perhaps, was all humanity ever needed to win. The next lesson didn't require gunfire. It didn't need chemical weapons or craters ripped into cities. It required only a mirror. The hollow system flickered once, then displayed something almost disappointingly mundane. No uniforms. No clear flags. Just the ancient, endlessly recycled story of humanity fighting itself. Professor Vraxel's voice was low now, cautious, like a man describing the anatomy of a predator whose mouth was still open. After external enemies grew scarce, he said, humans, being resourceful, manufactured new ones. Preferably, ones that looked a lot like themselves. On screen, footage played. Governments turning against their people. Rebellions eating their own revolutions. Alliances collapsing under the simple, inexorable weight of greed, mistrust, and fear. Commander Zern folded his arms across his battered chest. Survival, he said, taught humans one vital lesson. If you can't kill the threat outside, invent a better threat inside. The cadets sat stunned. They had braced for more wars. More bombs. They hadn't braced for this. The quiet wars. The slow betrayals. The slow carving away of trust until nothing was left but bone and suspicion. The simulation rolled on. Political purges. Witch hunts. Civil wars that started not with gunfire, but with whispered doubts passed hand to hand like deadly viruses. Humans dividing themselves by bloodlines, beliefs, the way they prayed, the way they looked at the sky, or didn't. The Vulcan exchange student, whose species had once nearly destroyed itself through tribal wars millennia ago, spoke. But they know, they said, almost pleading. They know what happens. They have the histories. The scars. Commander Zern's mouthparts twitched in something that might have been a smirk, or maybe just another old wound reopening. Knowing, he said simply, has never been humanity's problem. A ripple of uneasy laughter, a sound like breaking glass, passed through the theater. Professor Vraxel gestured vaguely at the scenes of cities tearing themselves apart. Knowledge, he said, is powerless against appetite. And humans, it seemed, were always hungry, for certainty, for victory, for someone else to blame. The hollow shifted again. Prisons overflowing. Camps fenced with barbed wire and good intentions. Neighbors informing on neighbors, then watching in terror as nooses tightened around their own necks. The cadets watched a mother and daughter dragged from their home in the night by men who spoke the language of law but wore the uniforms of fear. When survival became the goal, Professor Vraxel said quietly, betrayal became the strategy. A photosynthetic chlorine cadet, visibly withering under the psychological weight, croaked out. But why destroy each other when the real threats are outside? Zern snorted, a rough, unpleasant sound. Because the real threat, he said, is always easier to face if you pretend it's wearing your neighbor's face instead. The room fell silent. The cadets knew war. They had trained for it, theorized it, simulated it. But this slow, rotting, inward collapse? It was another kind of war entirely. And humans waged it with the same creativity and commitment they brought to every other form of self-destruction. The screen shifted once more. An elderly man standing alone in the ruins of his neighborhood, clutching a battered photograph of people who hadn't survived his love, his loyalty, or his luck. No speeches. No vengeance. Just a small, broken defiance clutched to a failing heart. For a moment, a breathless moment, the cadets could almost believe in human resilience. But then the projection continued. New flags. New slogans. New lines drawn in old sand. Another cycle. Another feeding frenzy dressed up as patriotism or justice or destiny. The hollow faded. No one moved. Professor Vraxel coughed gently. Tomorrow, he said, we explore human methods of post-conflict reconstruction. Or, as they often practice it, pre-conflict preparation. Several cadets groaned aloud. One mechanoid cadet muttered something that sounded suspiciously like an offer to volunteer for experimental memory deletion. And then, from the back row, reliable as ever, the blurb cadet wobbled upright and gurgled. At this point, I'm starting to think humans don't fight wars to survive. They survive, so they can fight better wars. The room stared at them. And, for once, no one could find a good argument against it. The room had long since surrendered any illusion of detachment. The cadets were no longer observers. They were witnesses. And what they witnessed next did not start with battlefields. It started with rocket trails. With great tongues of fire tearing holes through planetary skies as humans launched themselves upward, not to escape their blood-soaked history, but to export it. The hollow flickered, displaying ships crewed by Confederation standards, thick hulls, inefficient thrusters, but they burned with a kind of fury no engineering flaw could diminish. Professor Vraxel's voice was almost resigned. Having exhausted the possibilities of terrestrial conflict, humanity, predictably, expanded the scope of its ambitions. The projection rolled forward. Colonies on Mars. Mining bases in asteroid belts. Research stations hanging in the void like bruises. Each one a new foothold. Each one a new battleground waiting to happen. Commander Zern's cybernetic eye clicked faintly as he surveyed the footage. They brought their ghosts with them, he said, and made sure there was room for more. It wasn't said with judgment. By now, judgment felt like trying to empty an ocean with a cracked cup. The cadets watched as disputes over territory, resources, and ideological purity escalated among the stars. First came the riots. Then the private militias. Then full-fledged orbital bombardments against rebellious outposts whose only crime had been dreaming differently. A Vulcan cadet, still clinging stubbornly to the idea that evolution implied progress, whispered. They escaped gravity, but not themselves. The simulation shifted. Treaties signed with grand ceremony, shattered within decades. Federations formed, fragmented into bloody civil wars across planets they hadn't even finished terraforming. And amidst it all, the human spirit burned as bright and blind as ever. Hope, Professor Vraxel muttered, is humanity's most renewable and most toxic resource. Footage showed soldiers trudging across alien sands, weapons clutched in gloved hands, under twin suns that cared nothing for their valor or stupidity. They fought over rocks. Over ideology. Over memories of Earth so faded they might as well have been myths. The blurb cadet, slumped miserably in their seat, mumbled. They left home and brought all the furniture. Nobody laughed. The hollow shifted again. First contact with alien species. Tentative. Hopeful. And then, inevitable misunderstanding. Inevitable fear. Inevitable war. A fleet of human vessels firing on an alien delegation because of a translation error that rendered a diplomatic greeting as a threat. Commander Zern's mandibles clicked softly, a sound that might once have been a sigh. They don't wage war because they hate the alien, he said. They wage war because they can't recognize anything that isn't a mirror. The cadets flinched as the footage showed human fleets raising entire moons, vaporizing settlements whose only mistake had been existing at the wrong coordinates. And yet, in the ruins, humans built again. Built faster. Built harder. Built higher. Not out of repentance. Not even out of pride. But because, somewhere deep inside, humanity seemed constitutionally incapable of stopping. The hollow showed new colonies rising from the ashes of old wars. Children laughing in gravity wells barely stitched together by half-broken machines. The cycle continued. The cadets watched a mural being painted on the side of a crumbling space station. A clenched fist. A broken chain. A blood-red star. Symbols of rebellion, of hope, of defiance. Symbols, the cadets now understood, of an unstoppable biological need to turn every ending into a beginning, and every beginning into a battlefield. Professor Vraxel rubbed at his ocular lens with a weary tentacle. They don't learn to avoid pain, he said. They learn to navigate by it. The lights brightened slightly, not enough to offer comfort, just enough to reveal the haunted expressions across the assembled cadets. Commander Zern, perhaps sensing the rising despair, barked out a grim chuckle. Congratulations, he said. You've just learned the prime rule of human expansion. The blurb cadet, never one to let horror pass unpunished, mumbled. If you can't fix the engine, strap some extra rockets to it and aim for the next disaster. And, depressingly, it worked. The last survivors of the course gathered in the dim auditorium, a few dozen shapes huddled together like the leftovers of some great evolutionary culling. Commander Zern stood before them, arms clasped behind his back, the faint hum of his cybernetic implants the only sound. A new enemy rises, he said without preamble. They cannot be negotiated with. They cannot be reasoned with. His voice was colder than space. They can only be fought. The holodisplay flared, revealing grainy footage, too grainy even by military standards. Shapes moving against starlight. Forms wrong enough to make the cadets' hindbrains itch. Not sleek. Not elegant. Just inevitable. Predators carved by some universe that had long since given up on poetry. Professor Vraxel adjusted his breathing filters, as if trying to inhale less of the despair. Galactic High Command has decided, Zern continued, his voice a dry blade scraping against stone, that our existing forces lack a certain necessary depravity. There was no diplomatic phrasing here. No sterile reports to buffer the truth. The cadets shifted uncomfortably. Several glanced sideways, as if calculating how long it might take to fake a nervous breakdown and request reassignment to agricultural logistics. It would be too late. Thus, Zurin said, "We are turning to humanity." The words hung in the air like a slow, inevitable execution. The blurb cadet, who had survived this long largely by virtue of their inability to process fear at normal speeds, let out a wet, blubbery noise of disbelief. But Zurin only nodded grimly. Their brutality, creativity, and resilience make them unmatched. The hollow shifted again. Scenes played. Human soldiers adapting to alien tactics not by learning them, but by inventing worse ones on the spot. Civilians on collapsing colonies forming militias out of mining equipment and sheer spite. Officers drafting victory plans in blood, sweat, and curses without waiting for permission or hope. They survived, not because they were better. Because they refused to lose. The Vulcan exchange student spoke finally, voice barely above a whisper. But, they're fragile. Soft tissue, limited regenerative capabilities. No natural defenses. Zurin smiled grimly, his scarred mandibles twitching. Exactly. Because fragility didn't make them weak. It made them desperate. Desperation, it turned out, was a better forage for killers than any DNA sequence or armored hide. The projection shifted again. Footage of Earth's Special Forces veterans. Older now, slower perhaps, but every movement honed to lethal purpose. These were not the fresh, idealistic soldiers of recruitment posters. These were the ones who survived wars so dirty, history books quietly omitted them. Commander Zurin turned, scanning the assembled cadets. There weren't many left. Those who had fled, collapsed, or simply broken under the lessons of humanity's history were gone now. Only the stubborn remained. The foolish. The ones too curious, or too damaged, to quit. Perfect. You will be trained by them, Zurin announced. There was no roar of approval. No cheers. Only the quiet shuffle of species reassessing their life choices. Professor Vraxel coughed delicately. It is worth noting, he said, trying for a tone of optimism and landing squarely in bureaucratic dread, that of the last 3 training cohorts assigned to human instructors, 38% achieved operational readiness, and 61% filed for permanent psychiatric exemption. The Vulcan cadet raised a trembling hand. And the remaining 1%? Zurin shrugged. Last seen boarding a cargo ship labeled definitely not a mercenary company. Their current status is entrepreneurial. The blurb cadet made a gurgling noise suspiciously close to a sob. At the rear of the hall, the doors hissed open. 3 humans strode in. Not tall, not genetically engineered. Just efficient. Their uniforms bore Confederation insignia awkwardly stitched next to Earth symbols, like a bad marriage nobody wanted to admit was happening. The lead human, a woman with scars crisscrossing her face like a roadmap of bad decisions, surveyed the cadets with eyes colder than deep space. She smiled. It was not a reassuring smile. "Welcome," she said. "Forget everything you know about survival. We're about to teach you how to win anyway." A long, horrified silence followed. Then, inevitably, from somewhere in the back, the blurb cadet burbled. "I missed the part where we just got shot at." This time, even Zurin chuckled. Darkly. Because for once, the little gelatinous fool wasn't wrong. Not wrong at all. The door hissed open without ceremony. 3 figures stepped inside, 3 humans. There were no gleaming medals, no polished boots, no triumphant fanfare. Just scars. Old, angry things stitched into skin and bone. And eyes of gods, those eyes that had seen too much and learned to stop looking away. The cadet sat frozen, a living tapestry of biologies and biochemistries, all united by one sharp instinct, fear. Not the fear of annihilation. They had studied that. This was different. This was the fear of something that had survived annihilation and smiled through it. The humans wore Confederation uniforms modified to fit their ancient, battered bodies, but the patches couldn't cover the reality. These were creatures born of 1,000 betrayals, 1,000 tiny apocalypses. The lead human stepped forward. Her gait wasn't elegant. It wasn't rehearsed. It was functional, like a weapon that no longer needed to be admired to be feared. She surveyed the cadets the way a demolition expert might survey a building marked condemned. And then she spoke. "We've fought each other for millennia." The words dropped into the silence like stones into a frozen lake, cracking the surface, sending fractures deep into the core. "Imagine," she continued, voice low and unhurried, "what we'll do to a real enemy." The cadets didn't move. They barely breathed. Because it wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. A collective shiver ran through the room, subtle but undeniable. Outside the academy windows, two stars burned together in an endless, suicidal spiral, brilliant, furious, and absolutely doomed. The Vulcan exchange student watched the humans and thought, not for the first time, that perhaps evolution wasn't a ladder at all. Maybe it was a noose. Tightening. And humanity, impossibly, was climbing it anyway. The humans moved among the cadets, not inspecting, not posturing, simply existing in that heavy, undeniable way that veterans did. The second human, a grizzled man missing 2 fingers and half a smile, spoke next. "Training starts tomorrow. You won't like it. We won't like it. Someone might die." He shrugged, utterly indifferent to the idea. "That's how you know it's working." A nervous, almost hysterical chuckle escaped one cadet, a sound quickly smothered under a wave of fresh horror. Commander Zern watched from the corner, his carapace gleaming dully in the low light. This had been the plan all along. Not to teach these cadets about humanity. To infect them with it. The third human, a wiry woman with a lopsided gait and eyes like gunmetal rain, leaned casually against the hollow console and added, "We're not here to save you. We're here to make you dangerous." Another silence. Not the fearful kind, this time. Something heavier. Something older. The kind of silence that remembers buried wars and unmarked graves. The blurb cadet, gelatinous and perpetually unfortunate, gurgled in their seat. "Define dangerous," they squeaked. The lead human grinned, a terrible, tired thing. "When you start laughing at your own funeral," she said, "you'll know you're ready." Professor Vraxel, who had long since abandoned hope of maintaining any respectable academic facade, sighed through 3 of his breathing sacs. This was it, then. No more theory. No more historical simulations. Just survival. And whatever came after it. Outside, the colliding stars flared, shedding layers of themselves into the void. Not surrendering. Consuming. Becoming brighter even as they burned away. It was, in a way, a fitting metaphor. Humanity didn't endure by avoiding destruction. It endured by dragging destruction along with it, grinning, spitting blood, and daring the universe to blink first. Commander Zern straightened. The time for lectures was over. Now came the bleeding. Now came the becoming. The blurb cadet raised a hesitant pseudopod. "So, just checking. Do we get dental with this training package?" The lead human laughed, a sound like broken glass tumbling down a steel staircase. "Sure," she said. "If you can still find your teeth afterwards." And just like that, the new chapter began, with laughter sharp enough to cut the stars themselves. And so, as Earth's warriors step into the stars with scars older than nations and a fury deeper than black holes, a new chapter begins, not just for humanity, but for the galaxy itself. What will they destroy? What will they save? Or will they simply survive because they have forgotten how to do anything else? Tell us below, if humans are the ultimate survivors, what could possibly stand in their way? Smash that like button if you believe survival is humanity's greatest weapon, drop a comment, and subscribe to HFY Sci-Fi Love and War Stories so you never miss the next brutal, beautiful tale. Remember, only those forged in chaos truly understand what's coming.